We'll see how we'll do. I'll lower my voice slightly. How does that sound? I was once told that to be effective, you're supposed to lower your voice about half an octave and speak slowly. You may not know what you're talking about, but it sounds like you know what you're talking about, which is the first principle of Washington, D.C. My name's Ron Marks, for those of you who do not know. I'm an old CIA guy, also by way of Capitol Hill. I'd worked for Bob Dole for a number of years, and have been in the IT and cyber business for about the last 20 years, but still involved here and there in the politics of the land and still living in Washington, D.C. I had been approached about a year ago to talk a little bit about what spying is now in the 21st century. This is a lot different a game than I played when I first joined back in the 1980s. And having been a part of it, a little bit on the outside of it in terms of looking at it from the IT and cyber standpoint, I thought, well, it's an interesting set of topics. So what we're going to do over the next more than 7 weeks, but it'll be essentially 7 seminars, is take a look at different aspects of spying and intelligence in the 21st century and how this volume of information, this overwhelming volume of information we're receiving and the ubiquity of that information, how that's affecting us. And not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector as well. Because we now have a very different game in terms of the kind of information that's available and how it can be analyzed and who it can be presented to. And you're now your all own best editors with tons of information flowing over the top of you. And some of these young people around here, in Gen Z at this point, this is what their lives are and how they're going to live it from now on. So the idea was to look at different aspects of it. We had Roy Hartsfield here last week, who had been the head of HR, Human Resources for CIA's Digital Innovation Directorate, taking a look at what kind of people you would want to bring into the intelligence community nowadays. Clearly with much more of a background, not necessarily by major, but looking at people who have capabilities in the cyber arena and understand what that world is. As we move forward here, we're going to be looking at different aspects of policy and different aspects of how people are dealing with it in the private sector. And Randy Fort, my guest, the Honorable Randall J. Fort, had been Assistant Secretary for Intelligence underneath Condoleezza Rice, and had been Head of Corporate Security at Goldman Sachs, as well as being involved with Raytheon Corporation, dealing in the cyber arena. He's also been deeply involved in looking at issues of artificial intelligence and information management in the cyber age, both in public and private side. So the fact we can get Randy out here as part 2 as we move down the line in these 7 seminars was really wonderful. So I'd like to welcome Randy. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Randy.
Just very briefly, 2 interesting aspects of the cyber age came about due to Randy's visit today. One of which was, and also frankly affecting our intelligence, since the United States government has determined that we have 0 tolerance for any kind of terrorism in the U.S. An alarm rang this morning in the tower at at National Airport in Washington, and the entire tower had to be evacuated, so that screwed up the entire schedule for National Airport, in addition to whatever other airline problems there were. So there's a 21st century problem. The second one, however, was interesting because while he and I were texting back and forth to know where he was, that's a nice function of the last few years, I was sitting there with Flight Tracker, which is following his airplane every single step of the way, which in my day when I first came into CIA would have been a miracle. So, again, things have changed very quickly. They're part and parcel of our lives, and it certainly affected the business that we were in. I always like to start off, because there's so many students here, to talk a little bit about careers first. So I guess, Randy, in terms of how did a kid from Cincinnati get to Washington? Let's put it that way.
Well, thanks, Ron, and thank you all. Thanks to the Dole Institute for the opportunity to be here today. Let me say at the outset, my comments reflect only my own views and do not represent the establishment, the established views of any corporation or institution I've ever been affiliated with. So this is just me talking, for better or for worse. So yeah, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I guess just as a matter of sort of personal interest, I was always interested in history as a child, and that sort of developed as time went along, fascination with military history, and then as I matured, that became an interest in more contemporaneous national security and the history of the Cold War. And having been a child of that time period, it always sort of fascinated me, particularly growing up in sort of the Red Scare stuff in the 50s and the nuclear. I was aware enough during the 62 missile crisis where I actually can recall doing duck and cover drills in my elementary school. And I guess some of that stuff, just those experiences made an impression, and I just sort of thought maybe I ought to be in on that. Can I have any sort of a role to play or influence on some of these activities? While I was still, I started at the University of Cincinnati. While I was there, I had an opportunity to work on the re-election campaign of a local congressman from Cincinnati. I did that. I transferred up to Washington. I worked in his congressional office for about 2 years while I finished up undergrad at George Washington University. Went back to Ohio to help run his subsequent political campaign there. Stayed around for a little while to work in his district office. So got a fellowship to go to Asia. I was in Japan. Henry Luce Foundation had a fellowship program. So I was the first foreigner to ever serve on the staff of a member of the Japanese Parliament in 1980. So it was sort of a chance to see how the Japanese operated politically after my 4 years of experience working for a U.S. congressman. And that was interesting, being 6'3" in the land of 5'5", and particularly at that point. I understand what it means, the saying sticking out like a sore thumb means. So traveled around Asia, came back in early '82 to D.C., and through a very fortunate set of circumstances, a college classmate working at the White House, I was given the opportunity to serve on something called the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board staff, what's now just called the President. They've dropped the F, I think, unwisely. It was a good brand, PFIAB, P-F-I-A-B. AT&T isn't just A&T. I mean, when was the last time somebody sent a telegraph, right? But or telegram. But anyway, in the early aughts, they dropped the F, so now it's just the PIAB. But anyway, I was on the staff there for 5 years, and that gave me my real serious introduction to first the executive branch, having worked on the Hill, but also the intelligence community. The PFIAB was established to do an oversight function of the IC and only reporting directly to the president and not through the intelligence community channels. From there, I followed Mr. Baker, James A. Baker, when he went to Treasury to be Treasury Secretary, and I was his head of intelligence for a couple of years there. And then when Mr. Baker moved to State Department, I went over, did my first bit there as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Then I had my sort of corporate wilderness years. I worked for a defense contractor, TRW, for several years, but got a great opportunity to work for Goldman Sachs in 1996 and worked there for the next 10 years. Half that time as Chief of Staff for the firm's President, Chief Operating Officer, and half the time as Head of Global Security. And then 2006, got a call from actually it was 2005, got a call from the White House, did I want to come back into government? And I did. And Secretary Rice needed a head of intelligence, and so I went in summer of 2006. I was confirmed and became Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. But interestingly, and I guess related to the topic we're talking about, when I got there in the summer of '06 and started getting briefed up by the various collective agencies of the intelligence community, of which there are, I don't know if there are like 16 or 17 now, something like that. I guess Space Command's going to make it 18, I think, if they set up an intel shop. Anyway, I started getting briefings, and I was made aware of the prominence of digital activity. Let's just sort of leave it at that. And in some of those meetings, I was just simply astonished at the level of effort. Let's just leave it at that. And so I came back to the office and started talking with my colleagues about, well, what are we doing with this cyber stuff? And people were like, cyber, how do you spell that? S-I-B-U-R, or what? You know, so it was interesting. I literally went around the building trying to find the places that I thought would be the natural home for this. Nobody, literally, no one wanted to take that on. And I kept nagging the secretary about it, and finally posed a question, what is U.S. foreign policy in cyberspace? And there was no answer to that question. I thought there probably ought to be. So long story short, since I was the only one asking the question, the only one evincing any interest, although I am far from, a technological, sophisticated person, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So they made me also the first head of cyber policy for the State Department in 2006. So we proceeded to begin the effort to drag the State Department into the 21st century in cyber policy terms. And at the end of the administration, I was given an opportunity to take a position with Raytheon, which is one of the top 5 defense contractors in the country, and I've been there ever since. So that's sort of the short resume CV review.
It's a good career.
We can dwell on any one of those, but so the typical can't keep a job, guy, and so you just go where the opportunities arise.
Why the intelligence side? You obviously had a good broad career in terms of politics. What is it about intelligence that grabbed you?
Well, when I got the
By the way,
opportunity,
he and I have known each other for 30 years, and that's the first time I've asked that question. So
well,
why intelligence?
I guess like a lot of people, a lot of students, I had read so many of the histories. I used to read up to a certain point, I guess maybe into the early 80s, I used to read every book there was about the CIA and the intelligence community, no matter how lunatic they may be, like Marchetti and
Right.
who was the spy, inside the guy that went down to Cuba. I'm forgetting what.
A.G. Phil A.G.
Yeah, A.G. And read them all, was just fascinated by all that. So it was really serendipity initially. I had been in touch with my college classmate who was had a senior appointment in the Reagan White House. And he knew that I was interested in coming in. He goes, well, there's this thing that's being reconstituted because the PIFIAB had been unwisely allowed to lapse during the Carter administration, so it had been regenerated by executive order in 1981, and they were just staffing up and kind of getting things. They had barely got their members lined up, and they were looking for some, basically gophers. And, I was like, I'll pay you to work on something like that. They're going to pay me money to go into the White House every day and do this job. So I was like, yeah. And I guess I just got the bug, It was, I never, I only have ever earned a bachelor's degree. I have no graduate degree. Every time I stopped and tried to go get the applications, and I did that a number of times, for the grad schools like the Princeton's, the Wilson School, or Fletcher, or SAIS, or any of those programs, I was in the middle of doing, really interesting things. And by the time I got to the State Department in the late 80s, at 89, as a deputy assistant secretary, I was, 32 or something, I guess, at that point. And I'm interviewing for what were then called presidential management interns. They were later rebranded post-Clinton as presidential management fellows, because intern kind of had a bit of a tarnished reputation for a while. And I was interviewing these young folks who were coming in. They were all master's degree holders from the very schools I was thinking about going to come in at a GS9 level, and I'm already a deputy assistant secretary at the SES level, and it kind of occurred to me, I don't think I need a master's degree to, that moment in time probably for me passed. So then it just became a matter of experience. But I've just always been fascinated by intelligence because when I was on the PIFIAB, I had a chance to work with some extraordinarily distinguished Americans, some of whom you may have heard of, like Henry Kissinger, Alan Greenspan, Claire Booth
You
Luce.
want to take a second to explain the PIFIAB too, as to why that organization, or what that is, and
Well,
what
so
the
the
function is.
board was established by President Eisenhower in 1956, and it was during the growth, a big growth period, and still in the relative infancy of the intelligence community. And he felt the need to have a group that was beholden to him to review intelligence community activities and provide him unvarnished advice and views that would not be influenced by any of the bureaucratic struggles, CIA versus FBI, CIA versus NSA, NSA versus Army, Intel, any of the typical things that he knew were a very prominent part of the bureaucratic infighting inside the Beltway. And so it was established in 1956, and it had existed right up through the Carter administration, where it was abolished and then reestablished. So there were about 18 members when I was there. As I was saying, people whose names you would know, Kissinger, Greenspan, folks like that, but also some brilliant Americans like William O. Baker, who had been the president chairman of Bell Labs, Johnny Foster, who had been the defense official and was the youngest head of Livermore Lab. I think at 29 years old, he was running Livermore Lab. Bud Wheelon, who was the first deputy director for science and technology at the age of like 30 or something like that at CIA. And so for 5 years, I got to be, I don't know, an acolyte, a student, a grad student. I was the, and gopher, frankly. But that was all right. I mean, I got to go sit down and one of the coolest things that ever happened, the lawyer Edward Bennett Williams, so one of the greatest, trial attorneys in American legal history. There was a draft report that I had on a project he was on the task force, and I had prepared the draft, and his office, Williams and Connolly, was just a few blocks from the White House, and so he wanted to review the draft, and so I put it in a pouch and take it up the block, and I thought going in, this has ever been, this guy's charging like $1,000 an hour or something, he's the guy who's like the man to call when you're in trouble, when you're in serious trouble in Washington, when Mr. Williams was alive, you called Edward Bennett Williams. He even got Frank Costello off. I mean, back in the day, he's a fascinating guy. I thought I was just going to take in the report, set it down, go out, wait in his outer office, let him read it. He'd make whatever remarks or give me comments, and I'd go away. Oh, come on in, sit down, bring call. Oh, yes, sir, sit down. He takes a look, picks up the thing, looks at it, sort of, and then he just starts shooting the breeze with me. And we sat there for like 45 minutes, about halfway in. Calls his secretary, get us some sandwiches, what do you want? What do you like? Oh, anything's fine. So I got like 45 minutes, almost an hour with Edward Bennett Williams. Right. And a while after that, I was having a drink with a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and my age, and he said, what are you up to? I said, blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, well, it was kind of cool thing. I had, lunch with Edward Bennett Williams. His jaw dropped, and he's like, I would give everything I own for a lunch with Edward Bennett Williams. And I thought, wow, that's really kind of cool. Yeah. So those were it was the exposure to the thinking, the acumen, the wisdom, the gravitas of that group of people that was my graduate school, and also got me even further, I think, intrigued by a lot of the intelligence activities that are out there. Everything from the human intelligence, which was your career, did a lot of time focused on a variety of analytic issues. The great debate about Soviet military spending, oh my God, that was one of the most crazy things. But I did have a chance to work with Alan Greenspan on that, so that was pretty cool. To all the space overhead architecture and all those systems and kind of everything in between. So it was a fascinating time.
And there's your PhD.
Well, I certainly, so there was one of the projects that I got to work on, and this was one of my indelible moments. The board, in the aftermath of the Chinko defection in the spring of 1986, was tasked to look at a variety of issues. A senior Russian KGB officer defected to the U.S. He was here. He was being debriefed. After a period of about 6 or 9 months, he redefected in the fall of that year, and so everything sort of was in turmoil because he had disclosed a number of very significant things. So there are a lot of serious questions. What happened? Why did he redefect? Did the agency screw up? Was what he told us real? Was this all just a big disinformation campaign, so on? But one of the things that he had revealed was that there was a recruited spy who had worked for CIA, a man named Edward Lee Howard, and so I was tasked with figuring out what happened with that, and spent about 6 months trying to untangle the very complicated series of events that had led to Howard's being recruited, and then how he escaped and ended up back in Moscow. And so I wrote this report that ended up being about 90 pages long. That just went through the chronology and all the ins and outs, and I talked to dozens of people, and it was fascinating. Well, the thing read like a spy novel, only it was real and
Yeah.
true.
Okay.
And so when the task force members went into the Oval Office to brief President Reagan, I was asked to go along since I was the principal drafter, as it were, of the report. And when we walked in and sat down, the first thing the president said was, "I wish I had the screenplay rights to this report." And that told me in that instant, anybody that said Ronald Reagan didn't read or that he was lazy, he read that report. He got it.
Yep.
And I boy, I was fit to burst. I couldn't
bet
wait
you
to
were.
call Mom. It was just, you wouldn't believe what just happened. So that was one of those moments that kind of underscored that my interest was I think well placed.
One or two of the young people here have asked me to tell some anecdotes about my time in spying, and I've been somewhat reluctant to do that. There's one young lady in particular who has been intrigued by some of the things, and one of the issues, in fact, that Randy just brought up was they brought us in to CIA in classes. It was just like a junior officer class. They would bring you in. And I came in October of 1983, and one of my classmates' husband had been killed in the embassy bombing in Beirut. Another one was a Marine who actually, when we were in the class just starting, his unit was in Beirut and had gotten blown up in the Marine barracks bombing. It's a pretty serious group, and what we were discovering after a little bit was that we had been identified, and it was very clear that that was happening. It was only later that we would find out that it was essentially Edward Lee Howard that was providing it. There was, however, a moment of shining pride in you're taught in these classes how to detect surveillance, to do your operational work, and the story, and it wasn't exactly true, and Randy knows the real story, but the story that should have been among the classes was Ed Howard had beat the FBI in terms of surveillance to get out of the country. So we took, while it was a disaster, we took a modicum of pride in that. And then very shortly after, as Randy well knows, we had a problem again with agents in Moscow being killed. And I was more directly involved with that in my position. And we were working with, there were a number of units within the Soviet European division that I was involved with, or that were there, and I was involved. I was the head of one of them. The head of another one of them was a fellow by the name of Rick Ames, who ended up being a pretty damning spy when it was all said and done. Really one of the top flight ones overall. Got 12 of our guys killed in Moscow. So anyway, those are two, Caitlin. If you want some more, I'll spin a few more out for you later on. Go back to the issue of sitting in a big important room, and whether it's in the Oval Office or whether it's in the Secretary of State's office or whomever else. These guys know a lot. They're there because they do know a lot, and they know a lot of people. How did you approach these sessions as you came into them? Obviously, you had to be well prepared, but as you, as a briefer, or you as an advisor, because an assistant secretary is a senior advisor to the secretary, how did you approach those meetings and to be effective and to try to get your point across, especially because even in those days, people would have other information from outside that they were.
Well, I think the way I approached it was, and it depended on the job too. And when I was at the White House on the P.R.I.S.M staff, we were reviewing situations that may have been a potential, a disaster sort of thing, like happened with the whole Chinko thing, and trying to pull out, sort of tease out the truth and what happened, what went wrong, and what needs to change so that those things don't happen. In my support roles, Condi Rice was one of the most impressive people I've ever met. She's brilliant, fluent Russian speaker, had been studying that country for decades. So what was a Russia, I don't care who the Russia analyst would be at CIA or in her own intelligence bureau, INR, the State Department is going to tell her something about Russia. She had a deep and, a deep and profound expertise. But the way I always thought about it was that the intelligence community had access to sources of information that could provide insights and reporting on aspects of different problems that would be outside of that policymaker's ability to be able to get that kind of information. And so whether that was signals intelligence or a recent image that showed some particular activity going on, or a report from a well-placed agent about plans and intentions and things like that, I always looked at it as being additive and not in any way a replacement for their or a challenge to their judgment. And it was only one form of information input. And when you think about it today, even more so, given the exponential growth in data, which we'll probably talk about here in a little bit, and the ability now with all the devices that you all have, anybody that is carrying around a smartphone or an iPad, you have the power and access to information that was equal to the entire U.S. intelligence community circa the late 1980s. You've got it all. You got HUMINT, SIGINT, imagery, open source analysis, multiple languages, translation tools, et cetera. Google just came out with a new translation thing, and that's when I said, well, it's a little buggy. Well, forgive me, it's the first version. In 10 years, it'll be down to slang and swearing and everything else perfectly fine. I mean, remember the first cell phones? Maybe some of you younger folks don't, but they were kind of big and clunky, weren't they? And now, the cell phone part of it would, fit on my little finger. It's all the other stuff, and frankly, the size of the screen, so we've got something to look at. I think the challenge is to try to understand, first of all, what issues they're working on, what are their problems, what don't they know that they would like to know, and that's a part of a dialogue that you have with your consumer. What's troubling them, what would they like to know more about, what are they working on, what questions would they like to, the hard questions would they like to have answers to. I mean, there was the whole thing from Rumsfeld, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And so, the policymakers may have a lot of experience and understanding of the known knowns because they've got their own ability to collect and discern information. The known unknowns, if it's an unknown, they'd like an answer to the unknown.
Right.
But they would also like, a heads up that, the Soviets are getting ready to, do something, or the Chinese are about to pull this, or, here's what's going on behind this guy you're meeting with is going to say, we've seen his talking points, and he's going to say this, but really what they're actually doing is this, and then you've given the decision maker, the policymaker, leverage. So that's the way I approached it.
What do you do when they don't listen? A lot of guys in our community, and I'm saying this because there have been some obvious cases here within the last couple of years where there have been some complaints. Now, by the way, that is not unique for the United States intelligence community, and at the risk of going permanently on the record saying this, I'll go for it. The United States intelligence community sometimes is a little bit like a spoiled child in the sense it often feels it knows a lot, and it does, but it often will expect to have its stuff listened to, and people such as Ronald Reagan or others have some other ideas. But how you approach that much differently? I mean, you've always had a much more cooperative approach. I was just curious in terms of sort of how you dealt with that if someone said, gee, that's awfully interesting, Randy, but I've got something else I need to do.
Well, I think a lot of it is particularly people who come in from the outside who have not had a lot of experience in Washington and who don't have a lot of direct experience with the intelligence community, their product, the procedures, the process, and so forth. I think that's incumbent upon the intelligence community and the senior leadership to make sure that they develop the relationship with those folks, be that the president or just a deputy assistant secretary of Commerce or something that's coming in that may have never seen HUMINT report or SIGINT or anything before in their lives, and that they understand what the capabilities are, but also what the limitations are, because let's be honest, the community's screwed up. It's gotten some things wrong.
Right.
In the 1990, we got dead wrong that Saddam Hussein was well down the road to having nuclear weapons. And when we finally got in there and found all the centrifuge parts and things, we were seriously shocked. Then we all know what happened in 2002 and 2003. They went a little bit too far in the other direction and said he did have WMD when his events would show he didn't. So the community, I never wanted to be arrogant. I could see, and then there were lots of other historical, everybody in the intelligence community missed the Cuban Missile Crisis except for the new DCI, who was just coming in at the time, E.C.H.E.L.O.N, who literally was looking at imagery and stuff on his honeymoon and sending cables back saying, I think something's going on in Cuba. Nah, nothing going on down there. And Bud Wheelon, who just came in as DDS&T, and he's like, yeah, something's going on there. So there's plenty of these examples historically, I think, that should be an antidote to arrogance if the community ever feels that way. So I think you've just got to start off on the right foot with people, and then hopefully show how you can add value as you go forward. But my perspective was always under promise and over deliver, and I think sometimes the bureaucracy can do just the opposite to its detriment.
When you move on to Goldman Sachs, and in that position, well, I talk a little bit about that position, but talk a little bit about it in terms of how you engage with, say, a CEO when you're the chief security person, information and whatever else, but also how I'm going to say this in a way that how do you justify that position in the sense of people often don't realize that when you're talking about chief security officers or chief executive officer, you're talking about overhead. You're talking about people who are getting paid and not necessarily contributing to the sales directly of an organization. How did you handle, how was that job different, say, than dealing as an assistant secretary with a Condi Rice?
Well, I started with Goldman in 1996, and there's still a private partnership. I didn't take the security job until 2000 and early 2002, post 9/11. And I think post 9/11, there was this much ash on the front door of 85 Broad Street, which was the headquarters of Goldman Sachs at the time, that had wafted down from the towers. And there was human remains in those ash. That made an impression on people. So I was involved for the first 6 months after 9/11 in a program. We had what we call disaster recovery plans previously, but the scale of a disaster was something like a fire knocks out a trading floor for a week. We need to have backup trading floor space somewhere else, or the building, somebody hits a power line in the building power, so we need a backup generator to keep, One New York Plaza, where our trading floors are located, up and operating. Nobody thought that southern Manhattan was going to be closed for months at a time. That wasn't in anybody's sort of imagination space. So in the immediate aftermath, we put together a team to look at what we now call crisis management. And since I had been involved in continuity of government activities in my prior government experience, I had had some experience in planning. And let me tell you, continuity of government, you've got like half the country nuked, and you're trying to reconstitute, and so those are pretty serious scenarios. So I'd had some experience in kind of thinking through, how do you multiply and harden communications, and how do you, hand off and leverage the global footprint and all that stuff. So I did that, and then in 2002, the fellow that had been our head of global security had been a senior FBI official who I'd recruited out of the bureau. He decided to retire, and there was a vacancy, and long story short, they asked me to take on that job. I always looked at it as, so I think in the private sector and the commercial sector in general, there are only two functions at the end of the day. You make money, you help your business make money, or you help them not to lose money.
Right.
You can do just as have just as much impact in stopping money from being lost, and that can be everything from coming up with a more efficient system that saves time because time equals money, or closing loopholes, or preventing, if you're a bank, you don't want bank robbers coming in. So I always looked at security as one of those elements to help protect our people, our information, and our facilities to enable the smooth and uninterrupted conduct of business. And I drilled that into our folks over and over again. We were not there to be an impediment. We were there to make sure that people could do their work effectively. I only ever put my foot down one single time when I was at a global security. There was somebody who wanted to fly into, I think it was Kuwait, but it may have been Qatar or one of the other Emirates. What I knew to be, because I'd been talking to people in Washington, like 24, 36 hours before Desert Storm 2, the invasion of Iraq was going to kick off in 2002. And I had already heard from my contacts in the community this was getting ready to kick off. And this guy wanted to fly in. I was like, hell no.
Yeah.
And his boss, the guy that headed up that entire business unit, called me up. Very senior guy. He's like, what are you doing? And I said, look, Phil, here's the deal. He's like, yeah, okay, thanks.
That might
and
be
I think I just saved us from having to spend, millions of dollars to extricate this guy, and maybe him being, in a worse situation because if Iraq started dropping scuds, again, as they had in the past. So it was really about trying to just make sure that where we were, how we did business, the means of our business, the modes of transportation, all those things were screened and tested and checked so that the people that were out there doing the business didn't have to think about security.
You were also sort of present when if there was a date for cyber to begin to bite, to take hold, the mid-2000s would have been it. How did that affect your life at that point? Because we were now starting to see deep levels of information, huge processes dealing with that, huge mechanisms to store it and to
Well, I'd never
analyze it.
really thought about, I guess in the 90s when I was still, before I had gone to work for Goldman and I was still with TRW, which was subsequently acquired by Northrop in the I think around year 2000, I started becoming aware of information warfare, as it was called in those days, InfoWar. And there were a number of meetings and conferences, and it was being kind of kicked around. But remember, in the mid-90s, internet was barely a thing, but growing by, 1,000% a year or something, as Jeff Bezos figured out in that time period and why he decided to get in the game. I wish I'd had that kind of awareness, but anyway. So I sort of seen it a little bit, but my first come to Jesus moment, I think, was in 2000. I was in a meeting at Goldman, and our CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer, just happened to mention in passing that our website was getting 30 million attack attempts per month in 2000, and I thought, what? That just seemed like a really large number. So I went and talked, what's going on? What does that mean? And, how do we deal with that? So that kind of brought the issue home that there was something very serious. And then as I indicated, when I got back into government, and during my time as I was Chief Security Officer, I worked very closely with the Chief Information Security Officer because, as we used to say, I was in charge of security for the carbon-based units, and he was in charge of security for the silicon-based units, but we had to cooperate because when it was ones and zeros floating around, he dealt with it, but as soon as somebody hit print and it turned into a piece of paper at a printer, that was my problem. So we had to converge and cooperate very closely, which we did. And I think it was out of that when I got back to state and I started being informed about the level of government activity, that it struck me that we needed a policy framework within which, because the community was basically out doing lots of very cool and interesting and important stuff, but there was no policy framework around that, no foreign policy framework or just national security policy framework around that. And I thought that was something that needed to be instituted so that when the inevitable bad thing happened, we would have, some mechanisms to deal with that.
As you moved out of state and back into the private sector again, what struck you in terms of the difference between the government and the private sector in terms of dealing with these issues?
Well, the government loves to admire problems. And a lot of times the admiration goes on for periods of time that I find just sometimes difficult to comprehend. There's also, I think, the bureaucracy can be sometimes indifferent to the technology changes. And a former DNI, Mike McConnell, who I served with when I was at State Department, would say over and over again, bureaucrats will choose failure over change every single time. And he would repeat that as a mantra. And you may think I'm kidding, but it's absolutely the truth. You get in more, there's one particular, I won't name them, but one particular government unit you get in more trouble doing something than in not doing something. You may get in trouble not doing something, but if you do something, there are two possibilities: failure, success. If you fail, you will be punished. If you succeed, well, you may get rewarded, but even that's uncertain. So don't do anything. And so I think there are insufficient incentives. A fellow that I worked for TRW, was a former senior government official. He had been the head of R&D at CIA and helped build a lot of the spooky black overhead systems. And he used to say over and over again, and this was his mantra: people behave exactly as they are incentivized to behave.
Right.
So if you incentivize people to take risks, they will take risks. If you punish people for taking risks, then they won't take risks. And I've said over and over again, if you wanted to, DOD, for example, is talking about need to be nimble and innovative and so forth. Just find a captain who's done a good thing and make him a colonel. He can do that. This is, the president, the SecDef. He can, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chief of Staff, can look over and go, you're a colonel now, okay? Don't you think all the little, all the little creatures out there in their burrows would look up and what was Joe just got promoted to colonel. What happened over there? What did he do? I want some of that. And, you incentivize behavior. So I think that is one of the critical aspects. We need to incentivize what we say we want in terms of change, at being able to adapt at network speed, coming up with answers that address some of these challenges that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, I think that's usually the last thing people think about.
Well, let's carry forward on that, because you have been involved in a number of projects, both within the government and in the private sector, in terms of there's a group called the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, which essentially acts as a think tank for the United States intelligence community, although not directly connected with them. There have been a number of issues in this direction in terms of information and the huge volume of it and how we're dealing with it and artificial intelligence. I just pick a couple of issues at this point. What are the ones that, I wouldn't say keep you up at night, but one of the ones you think to yourself, gee, that as we move forward here in now in the third decade of the 21st century, what is it that we need to be looking out for? If you're saying to the intelligence community, kids, what is it that's out? This is one thing we need to worry about. What are you telling them now?
Well, the first thing, and your mention of the time frame, I've made this point and repeat it often, particularly when I'm in meetings and things with our government officials. We are now 1/5 of the way through the 21st century. 20% of the 21st century is now kind of behind us. So why are we doing things like we did in the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s or 80s or even the 90s? We're in the 21st century. There are tools and technologies now that are there which could easily, if not replace, then certainly massively supplement the way we've done business before. And so that is sort of one just sort of general starting point. I think the issue of big data is something that everybody's struggling to deal with. So here's a statistic. I've heard this a couple of times at meetings. As of the year 2009, the total amount of data created in all of human history, from when the first caveman took a charcoal ember and made a mark on a cave wall, to 2009, was 0.8 zettabytes of data. A zettabyte being 10 to the 18th or a sextillion. So 0.8 of 1 sextillion of information, 2009. As of this year, 35 zettabytes of data, a 44x increase in 11 years. So that's the curve. All of human history, flat, 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 a little bit, and then straight up, exponentially. And so we're at 35 zettabytes of data, and we're adding, more than a zettabyte a year, and They had to, actually, this was about 5 or 6 years ago, they had to add new prefix numbers to the bytes because the largest number they had was 10 to the 24th. They needed 10 to the 27th and 10 to the 30th. So they came up with yottabyte was the biggest at 10 to the 24th. They actually, I mean, you think about 10 to the, well, you think that's crazy. But that's the progression. That's where it's going. There's a fellow named David Bray who was the CIO at the FCC for a number of years. He's with a think tank now. And he pointed out that he took the mass of email addresses, IP addresses under Internet Protocol version 4, which was the dominant internet system until I think about 2014. If you put all them into a mass, he said, imagine that a size, it would come to the size of a beach ball. And he said, now we're transitioning to IPv6. What will the size of that mass be when it's fully instantiated? And so what would you say? What would you guess? Beach ball versus the next thing? You know, Bueller, anyone? People, well, it'll be as big as this room, which, you know, this is a large room. Imagine all the beach balls we could fit in here. Or somebody, big as the Pacific Ocean. Well, that's a pretty big ocean. A lot of beach balls there. Big as the moon. Then his next slide, it's a picture of the sun. So you go from a beach ball to a sun. That is your exponential progression. We don't think exponentially. We think linearly, incrementally, and arithmetically. You count 1 to 31, arithmetically, you get to 31. You count 1 to 31,
Right.
Exponentially, you get to 1.1 billion. That's the power of exponential growth. So there is this you know, amount of data, the words, you know, the agile, well, it's a tsunami, explosion, volcano, blah, 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 you know, whatever. It's just a lot of data that is going to overwhelm, and I think has overwhelmed, outside of a few places like Google and Amazon, you know, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Google, those guys seem to be doing a pretty good job of managing, manipulating, and leveraging data. But I think the government is, in general, and the intelligence community in particular, is really struggling with that. And so that is going to be, I think, one of the big challenges. There's a lot of other things, AI, quantum. One of the things that I'm trying to think through the implications of is virtual reality.
Right.
We are at the Model T, Model A stage of virtual reality right now. You've seen the headsets that exist. They're big and clunky, just like every other technologies. You've got to put on a big old hairy headset that, you know, looks like a scuba mask on steroids, and you're kind of tethered to a thing, and everybody's like, oh, that's big and clunky, and yeah. Well, we'll wait till, you know, 10 years from now when this will be your virtual reality headset, or the contact lenses, and you'll just blink and then you'll be online, or maybe it'll be an implant, and you'll have instant access. And if you think that sounds crazy, have you seen people walking down the street these days? I watch. I'm not a digital zombie. I don't, you know, have to stare at a screen or have the earbuds in or the things on and be, you know, digitally zoned out all the time. But I watch, and it's easily, you know, 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 6 people walking down the street these days, at least in Washington, are plugged in doing something digital. And so when virtual reality gets here in a big way, I think it's going to disintermediate a
Right.
lot of things. It's going to disrupt higher ed. Why go to why all this bricks and mortar? Why would you not just want to put on your visor and we're all sitting here just as we are right now, and we are in 50 different places on the face of the earth because we all found out, okay, it's 1400 Zulu, go to this website or go to this IP address, and we're all there. And we're all having, magically, the company down in Florida 5 years ago had technology good enough you could play poker because you could read tells. That's 5 years, that's 3 Moore's Law cycles. So VR will dominate, certainly entertainment.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who is actually I tried to get him out here at one point, but it didn't quite work, was a screenwriter, you'd met him, Ed Neumeyer, RoboCop and Starship Troopers. And Ed was saying that one of the great fears in the industry right now is how do you deal with the lack of, in terms of a lack of a proscenium? What do you do when, you know, you're staring at a movie screen, there's a thing over the top of the movie screen you're looking at. What happens if people can walk through the actors?
Yeah, you'll have to inhabit the scene.
If you inhabit the scene.
For as long as there has been drama, going back to the ancient Greeks, there was a stage and there was an audience. And it was very flat, and, you know, there was lighting and there's scaffolding and there's, you know, the camera ever goes, just that much over, you reveal that it's, the spell is broken because you see all the gaffers and all the guys standing back there with the lights and the microphones and all that. Well, if you can't do that if you're going. So entertainment will be big. I think it'll disintermediate a lot of transportation. I've taken more airplane flights cross country around the world to have like a 2-hour meeting when I just put on the headset, have the meeting, take it off, go do what I'm doing. You got to wonder about museums. You got to wonder about, what's Disney. Why would you want to go to Disney World if you could experience Disney World from your own Barcalounger? I mean, no, seriously. I mean, this is going to be. It's all going to be right there. You won't have to go anywhere. You'll be able. If ones and zeros exist of something, you'll be able to go there. You want to walk on the Mars and follow along behind the Mars rover? Well, why not? You can't. You want to swim the Marianas Trench? You want to climb Mount Everest? You want to go rafting down the Amazon? You can do all that because it'll be, as long as there's ones and zeros, that artificial reality can be replicated, and you'll be able to experience it.
Let me ask one last question, and we'll turn it over to the audience. Artificial intelligence. Defense Department has just put out a very long set of statements with regards to the use of artificial intelligence, and AI has been one of those things that everybody just loves to talk about, and sort of has a clue what it is, maybe or maybe not. One of the questions of artificial intelligence, if it does learn, if it is a learning device, is at what point in time do you put human beings into this? Or do you? I guess maybe just some general thoughts about AI in terms of how we do our business and where that goes from here over the next 10 years, because it certainly is not going away. It's developing quite quickly.
No, and again, I think when AI, we're at the point of the curve where it's not quite gone vertical yet, and that's if you listen to people like Ray Kurzweil, then we'll reach what he calls the singularity, where the artificial will reach a level of sort of human consciousness, and he predicts about 2040. The guy's got a pretty good track record, so when he makes a prediction, you got to look really hard at it. Whether that'll be the case or not, I don't know. I think this is going to be one of those things that is getting a lot of attention, both commercially, because you've got advertisers that are trying to look at our every move, our every gesture, our blink, our breathing, our stance, to make a determination about whether we're pleased with a particular product or whether they can sell us something. And to the more esoteric about the command and control for weapon systems and that kind of thing. We've already kind of crossed the line in defensive weapon systems. There is autonomy in, for example, the Vulcan phalanx gun system on a lot of Navy ships that's designed to, it's like a big 20 millimeter Gatling gun that was looking at incoming missiles, and you can't have a human trying to put the crosshairs on the missile coming in. That's got to be an automatic system. So we've already sort of made that decision. I think we're going to have to. I heard a construct there where we've always talked about man in the loop, the idea that there's a human in the loop of the decision making. There may come a time, especially when decisions have to be made in milliseconds, and even single milliseconds. And what is a millisecond? When you blink, that takes 300 milliseconds. So you think about, literally a fraction of a blink in the literal sense. Man in the loop in that instance, we won't be able to process and make a decision, but man on the loop. And so aware of what those processes are, and to have oversight and control of how those systems are implemented. I think that's a better kind of metaphor to the way to think about these things. But there's going to be a lot of experimentation, and we're going to have to feel our way. I think sometimes the media is not a help. There's after however many million miles of autonomous cars driving around in Florida and California and a few other test places, there was finally an accident. Somebody got killed. Okay, one for autonomous, and how many tens of millions of people have been killed by other people driving cars?
30,000 a year.
30,000 a year in this country, but it's like 1 million a year globally. And I mean, you add that up. I mean, it's tens of millions, maybe even more than 100 million people have been slaughtered in automobiles running into each other for about 100 years. So one versus, there's a very large number on the other side. They got a ways to go, the autonomous does, before it gets even close. So I think we need to kind of approach these things with, with kind of calm and deliberate, and try to find the opportunities to test the things in areas that are not, life-threatening or life-urgent, and then roll them forward. But I think, AI is going to be a great enhancement in a lot of ways. If it can figure out if an AI can figure out how to synthesize a lot of information which we haven't been able to do before and cure cancer, me, I want that, because, not that I have cancer, but I've had relatives die of it, and if I ever get it, I'd sure like to think there's something out there that is, more than just a few doctors' brains that are going to figure out how to make me better. So there's a lot of upside to these things too, and I just think we have to keep the balance in mind.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is your opportunity. Caitlin is back there with the microphone. Please open up for questions. Anybody? Anybody being shy here?
Thank you. At preamble, I would love, with your background, for you to answer a question revolving around Wall Street intelligence and information in relationship to September 11th. I'm aware from History Commons reporting and a source at the managing director level of Goldman Sachs that the entire office in Tokyo of Goldman Sachs was shut down for September 11th. No one showed up, and no managing directors were in the New York office on September 11th. And then the second part of that is that it was reported on that day by
Well, let's not go into that. If there's a specific question on intelligence issues that we've just discussed, I would love to do that.
Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and do
Okay,
that then?
that question was about the threat to the SWIFT banking system by Israeli intelligence in white vans that day to the George Washington Bridge. It was reported on TV news and then never reported again. Are you aware of that? And what were there these intelligence and financial threats as an overlay to September 11th?
Well, I don't know where you got your information about managing directors not being present, but that's utterly false. In fact, the management committee was meeting that day in New York, and that was the top managing directors and partners of the firm. There were dozens of them. It was a normal business day, so that's utterly false. I don't know. And the Tokyo office was, and I don't remember, the only thing I can think of Tokyo office not being operating was it was one of the many Japanese holidays, and I don't recall that that was the case. So I don't know where you're getting your information, but in point of fact, that was false. In fact, I was scheduled I had a conflict that day. I was starting a new position in the Goldman office in Washington. A report that I'd worked on was being briefed to the management committee that day. But I was also a member of a then DCI advisory committee, and we were having a meeting at Fort Meade at NSA headquarters, and so I had to decide whether to go up to New York that day or to go to NSA headquarters. And I opted because I thought that was more relevant to my new role, and I knew the people could deliver the report in New York, and so I was at NSA headquarters and was a part of the group that had to evacuate that building because when there were still uncounted airplanes. So as far as Israeli vans on the bridge, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Let's actually take not that question, but what goes into that question, which is one of the challenges of cyberspace has been, it's a question of volume, it's a collection of velocity, it's a question of variety of different things, but it's also been a question of veracity, which is, a number of things are put out very, very quickly, and we have the 2016 election and all that to talk about. But how much of a challenge do you see that as going forward? Because clearly these are the kinds of things that are often out there. People will take them on board.
I used to give a talk. It's been a number of years since I've done it, but the truth from the internet. And I just took a bunch of facts that, came off the internet and say, a duck's quack doesn't echo when a cow can walk up steps, but not, I read it on the internet, so it must be true.
A wonderful picture, by the way, of Abe Lincoln on the internet saying, don't believe everything you see on the internet.
Right. So I think that's actually
a lovely picture. Yeah,
that's actually one of the I think there's a role there for the intelligence community, which will be to become a verification function, because as people are able with their own devices and their own personalized search engines and so forth to go out and find information, what is true and what isn't, and to try to have an accurate portrayal of reality. I think who owns reality, who controls reality,
Right.
who manipulates reality will increasingly be the high ground of the 21st century. So I think there is a role, if the intelligence community wants to think of it, not as an arbiter of truth necessarily, but as people are trying to struggle with what is true, and to have an expert voice that
Right.
would be able to help sift through the volumes of information and reach what they can conclude to be an accurate assessment of what is actually true and real.
Yeah, the coronavirus has been fascinating in that direction as well. I mean, there have been all kinds of rumors out there, and I finally saw Anthony Fauci from CDC out there at long last sort of laying out, all right, here's really what the reality is. With 30, 40,000 cases, it is a high casualty rate. Most of it is being confined to China at this point, but you would think, of course, by rumor, especially in this day and age, more so than SARS, when you and I were sitting over in some of these groups listening to that there's this tremendous impact, and it's tremendous impact on China
Well,
and the economy. And
When you think
as
about
well
it,
as-
when we had SARS, there was next to no social media.
Right.
I mean, there was no
Right.
Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram, there was no, whatever your flavor, imager, whatever, any of those things that are out there, they did not exist when SARS was a thing. And so what we've done is we've amplified the transmission of information. Literally, half the planet has some version of a smartphone. And if you have a smartphone, you have a global megaphone. Because all you can do, everybody that has a smartphone can download a Twitter app, and you can talk to the whole world. You don't need to own a radio station, newspaper, or television station. In fact, you probably don't want to own a newspaper these days. That's a losing proposition. But if you've got a Twitter account or any one of these other apps, you have a global megaphone. And that amplification now of things that I think is part of the struggle which is why, if you're a government, and communist dictatorships are not exactly the most open and transparent and communicative forms of government, as we've seen since there have been communist dictatorships. So that was, I think, part of the problem with this coronavirus. The Chinese government was just
panicked.
very slow to get off the mark, and
Right.
you had people down at the local level who were afraid of getting their heads cut off if they
Right.
reported bad news. And so and then you can be anywhere on the planet, from one point on the planet to anywhere else on the planet in 48 hours. That's just modern.
Yep.
That's the modern day. You may not be able to make it to the top of Mount Everest in 48 hours, but you can make the base camp from where we're sitting to a base camp of Mount Everest in 48 hours, and just about anywhere else. And so we're dealing now with challenges in public health that we've never had.
Never
Yeah.
saw before. Which makes it, by the way, an interesting aspect of intelligence now. I was talking to a young lady who actually will be our last guest in this series, Jen McLaughlin, and we were talking about thinking about intelligence now, not just about old James Bond running around, or the collection of intelligence, or for those who remember the pictures of the U-2 flying over Cuba and taking all that. This is intelligence. This is national security. Where are we sitting with coronavirus right now? How fast is it spreading?
Well,
Who's
biotechnology,
following this out?
biotechnology, the bioeconomy, those are all kind of 21st century challenges. And when you look at the CRISPR tool that now can, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a biologist who, for about $100,000 more or less, was able to create a horsepox bacillus that, using CRISPR, that was benign. But if you could do that, then it's possible to imagine somebody who would be, with incredible bad intent to try to create something that would be, a pathogen that would have no cure. And these are the kinds of things that we have to start thinking about now, because the capabilities, the tools are out there to do that.
Any questions? Over here.
So I want to ask a question about the flip side of your getting more of what you're inclined to incentivize, and that is to what extent you believe that the current protections for folks in doing what they perceive to be their jobs are sufficient. It seems to me, and I may be wrong on this, but that analysts and whatnot in the intelligence business often offer you know, unpleasant opinions, contrary opinions, things that may be, you know, that the policymakers either choose not to act on or maybe would like to hear less of. And there seems to me to be a concern about to what extent the folks that offer those sorts of opinions within the system and appropriately in whatever the chain of command is, are protected from retaliation for expressing inappropriate opinions. And this isn't necessarily just true in the intelligence business. You hear about it with the EPA scientists and the FDA people and everybody else. And I'm wondering, from your experience, is it your sense that the civil service protections, that the other sorts of things that are there are sufficient to protect people when they offer contrary opinions, unpleasant opinions?
I think in the aggregate, the answer is yes, there are protections. If you're an intelligence officer, you know, you have to be willing to deliver, a warning. You know, a black swan is about ready to land, whatever that might be. Most people kind of go about, you know, today was pretty much like yesterday and tomorrow will be pretty much like today. And we kind of, for the most part, that's the case until the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. And then, you know, today doesn't look anything like yesterday and tomorrow will be completely different. So, you know, if you're doing what you're there to do, and the intelligence community basically exists because no more Pearl Harbors, and then we ended up with a 9/11, and so there was a, you know, why weren't we connecting the dots? Well, because stupidly we actually were building walls so dots couldn't be connected, and patting certain government officials were patting themselves on the back for building that wall high, and so that the dots couldn't be connected. And when we discovered to our chagrin that, you know, that wasn't a good idea. I think that's also a matter of leadership and management in the community. If you're going to be a senior official of the community and you've got analysts that come along and say, this is what we think, as long as that information can be grounded on facts, on collected information, on some sort of a methodology that, you know, gets you from point A to B to C, and here's the conclusion, then it's a responsibility of the leaders of whatever the entity is that created, you know, that information or collected that information and processed it to present. And then, you know, the policymakers get to accept it or ignore it. And then but they're the ones who are ultimately accountable. They have to, you know, they have to face the voters or face the Congress and answer for what they did or didn't do. And so I don't think there's I don't personally believe that there's an issue with that. I still think if somebody has something that they think is now, if on the other hand, if people who are government civil servants want to venture into politics and step into the political venue and begin to make political charges, then we're in a different realm, and that's where it gets very, very tricky, as we've seen in recent months.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of not just leadership responsibility to the individuals, but the individual's responsibility to the organization. I'm maybe a little harder over than Randy is on a couple of these things, but the one thing I'm really hard over on at this point is that when I was an analyst or I was an operations officer for CIA, guess what? It says CIA on it. So as an individual, I was a part of a corporate body. And I may not have liked the decisions that were coming down, but that was part of the job. And I think what you'll often see in the cases of people, and maybe we could run the list down, including A. Snowden, you know, who aren't happy with the resolution that they've been presented with, who feel as though they have been aggrieved. First of all, it makes good press. I mean, God knows it makes good press. I'm just watching this thing recently in the paper where the kids are, you know, firing Nerf balls back and forth in their cyber unit there. Oh, CIA gets it. Well, it's corporate. Any corporation has nonsense going on. The question is, again, when you sign and as a officer or whoever else in CIA, you raise your right hand and say, repeat after me. You know, you've sort of pledged an organization there. And so if you don't like it, fine, understand it. There are a lot of things I haven't liked over time. Sometimes you got to take it. Is it right or is it wrong? Well, guess what? That's sort of what you signed up for. The second part of it is, and it's to some extent a generational thing as well. And I'm always reluctant to say anything about Gen Xers who now hold my life in their hands, including the one with the mic over there. But there is, I'll blame it on the Gen Y guys. Okay, let's say this. There is a much more an individual approach to corporate organizations now, in terms of being listened to, in terms of demanding. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's bad for organizations, but it is a different approach perhaps than our generation took. And that does influence it as well. My wife in her last few years was noticing that in terms of a very different approach of younger people, frankly, asking for more and asking for different. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's just the way it's that's the way it's working right now. What was another question here? I'm sorry, sir.
Say we find ourselves at a point where nations around the world are implementing AI into the intelligence community. How do you think that they would be used?
Well, I think there are probably several dozen nations that are spending a lot, making a lot of effort to pursue artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities. There are a lot of challenges to it. One of the challenges, as I understand, again, I'm not an expert, but is coming up with data sets that are of sufficient size, number one, and then that the data is clean, it is organized, and it is recorded, and it is the data is accurate. And you need those large data sets in order for the algorithms to do enough cycles and processes in order to come up with whatever pattern and recognition it will achieve. So different countries have different ways of dealing with it. China's got 1.3 billion, basically subjects that they can do anything they want with their personal data. We, stupidly, are giving them reams of our personal data. Anybody here done the DNA thing? Guess what? It's all in China. All those labs are in China. They got your DNA, and they're taking that on top of their own people's DNA. They've already stolen the OPM files and the files from Equifax and the Anthem Health and all the other data that they've, and then we willingly give, because Blue Cross and others are using, Chinese facilities to process things. So they have a denominator of 1.2 or 3 billion, plus we're giving them all of our data, and so that gives them a tremendous competitive advantage. Because privacy, I don't think that word exists in Chinese, so they can pretty much do whatever they want, and without having, the New York Times editorial board, jump up and down if, in our case, the U.S. government wants to take a data set and do something with it for national security purposes. So we're going to have to, work through a lot of this, and if we're going to end up being competitive, and having the systems that will do what we will need them to do, either commercially or for government purposes for national security.
Yeah, I would dare say, just piling on something that what Randy was saying here, China has been beautiful at essentially building a social credit system for their society. China is the modern version of the mercantilist society that you saw in France during the 1700s. It's all about the country. It's all about the glory of China. It's about China essentially being a dominant power by the mid-21st century. They will achieve that through technology, the ability to maneuver their very large population at 1.4 billion. Remember the one thing about China, the guts about China, is that they went through the 100 years of humiliation, as they call it. It was also 100 years of turmoil, revolutions and civil wars in a country, constant. They like order, okay? It is not just them dominating the world, they just like order. And they like to be able to control, and they don't care who does or does not like it. The minorities in China are oppressed. We can go down the whole list, but the fact of the matter is that this kind of information is available to them, makes it easier for the state to do its job. The kind of information they're collecting on us, I must admit, my first thought was they're basically collecting all the information on people in the defense industrial base. So they know exactly where we're going, how we're doing it, who to follow, what to do. And these are not necessarily extensive, algorithms that it takes to follow people and see where they're going and what they're doing and which projects they're involved in. And to have something, for instance, like a Huawei, where, basically they're just sitting there and just would be collecting information. I'm less worried about what they're doing, as Mom would say, than I am about what we're doing in our house. And I'm not sure we've been terribly good about the security side of all of this. That would be another thing I would say in terms of the kind of work that Randy's had to do and to be in the forefront of, which is that the system was not built to be secure. It wasn't. It was built, he and I have a mutual acquaintance in Vin Cerf, who was one of the founders of the net, and it was basically, the internet was built on, cyberspace was essentially built on DoD classified systems, Defense Department classified systems. So security has been retrofitted to this process, and it's been like all things that get hung on things that are, new things on old things. It hasn't worked terribly well, and the Chinese have actually been, they've had their problems too, but they have really taken advantage of that. And that gives them, in terms of the 21st century, I think, an information leg up over us. The old days was about bombs and bullets. This is about information now. And in that way, they've got a good leg up over us. Any other questions?
We can do one more.
I think we've overwhelmed them. Randy, I can't begin to thank you enough for coming on out here. This
Nice
has
to be
been
here.
a pleasure. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. Next week, we will have Stephanie Pell from West Point talking about privacy issues, in fact. So again, thanks, buddy.
Yeah.
Really appreciate
Sure,
it.
that's good.